Hey everybody, this is going to be TW134. Continue our conversation with Stephen Scott. We're just going to jump right into it. I think it's often worthwhile for people who have perceptions about a specific group to see that group act. So you and Sean, the thing that is great about your show, and then you bring on other people like Mike. You don't have me back anymore, but we're going to talk about
You're
that.
Welcome anytime, but you're always busy and you never bother with WhatsApp.
How
I'm
long
not
did
using
it take
messages
us
for
to get
sending
you on
audio.
WhatsApp, Tomasi?
No, I'm actually firmly in WhatsApp now. Because one, I've been bouncing between devices, so I'm using iPhone and Pixel, so I'm actually in WhatsApp a whole lot more than I used to be. Yeah, man. So just shoot me a message.
Next week on Double Tap, Damasi Thomas.
But the one thing that is great about you guys' conversation is, like you said, you have the type of conversations that me and Mike have. And the best way I can explain that to people who aren't used to either of us or the way that we behave is like, it's like sitting down having a conversation with your friend, because that's what you are. Your friends. Yeah. You're not on-air talent that got thrown together to make this show that somebody scripted. You guys get on and, yeah, sometimes you're talking about your KFC addiction, which, man, you got to work on that. You got to work on that, man. We need you around a little longer. You got to cut back on the KFC, man.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because actually one of the things, and thank you for that, but one of the things I've started doing, and this is something I haven't talked about in the show, for very strict reasons. For me, no one's told me, and this is something else people often ask me as well, are you ever told not to talk about something? You know what? Mr. F is the greatest guy in the world. He lets me say what I want to say on the air. And I'm sure there's things that could get me hung most days. and when I go off on one, I know I could get myself in trouble. But, I say it from the heart, and I think people know that. And so when Sean and I, and Sean does it too, he'll have a rant about something, he'll have a view on something. And there's at no point do we say, of course, we have a conversation. We'll say, should we talk about this? Or is this something we want to get into? Sometimes we'll even debate it out before the show. So we'll have a conversation about it, and then I'll realize that either one of us or neither of us have really got a good argument to make. So we think, let's not do that now. There's been a few conversations that have come along where we've said, this would be a great topic, but do I have enough knowledge in this, or do I have enough to say without someone else in the room, without a third person at the table, to make this a worthwhile conversation? And so you have to have that kind of debate amongst yourselves beforehand as well. There are times, though, and I mean, there's examples like Janine Stanley came on, and we were due to talk about ACB, and we ended up talking about prosthetic eyes for like 40 minutes. And it was the most fascinating conversation that I've had on that topic. Things I learned, things I didn't know. It was just incredible. She was so open and so honest. And I said to her afterwards, I said, I cannot thank you enough for being so open. And I actually said to her, look, and we do this a lot with guests, because especially I think people, not all guests, because they don't all know us. I mean, some people come on, they've never heard of the show. They come on because they're promoting something or whatever, and that's fine. But the people who know us, I think, get very relaxed very quickly, and sometimes you almost have to remind them, you're on air, right? This is being recorded, because there's a few times you think, you're getting into something really deep here, and I'm okay with it, but are you? And so there are times we have recorded, we've stopped, and I've said, do you want this to air? Are you okay with this? Do you want me to send it to you so you can have a listen to it first? Are you sure you're okay with this? And I've never had anyone say no. They generally say, you know what? No, I felt comfortable. I said that the way I wanted it to be said. And so the same with Janine when she had that conversation. That was not scripted. If you scripted that show, if you said every day we had to do this or we had to do that, again, I go back to the Howard Stern film, right? I go back to the Howard Stern film. There's a clip I used to demonstrate how formats can kill a show. I was doing a talk for AMI actually back a couple of years ago, and I brought up this clip, and the clip is of Howard Stern being told by his boss that he has to do the temperature and the time every 15 minutes. So whatever he's doing, he has to do temperature and time 15 minutes past the hour, 30 minutes, 45, and top of the hour. So he starts telling this story, and it's a made-up story, and he's doing this deliberately to annoy the boss. But he starts telling the story of how his grandmother was killed in a car crash. And he's doing the story, and he's explaining, and there was a crash, And she was just there, and she was dead. Oh, hang on, it's 14 degrees Celsius, and it's 15 minutes past the hour. So she's lying there dead, and it was just the way that he did it was so clever, because he hit the point perfectly, which was how in the middle of that story you're sitting there gasping. I mean, I did a show once, and it'll always stick in my mind. It was a talk show. It was a late night talk show. And a guy came on, and we were having some fun on the air as we were doing, and a guy came on and he told me, frankly, he wanted to end his life. And what followed was a 1.5 hour conversation on the air. Didn't play ads. Didn't go to the news. Just talked. And it was so powerful that, people in the station stopped doing their job. They sat and listened to the radio. I had people tell me that police, and I know this because I knew some of the local police who worked in the area, they said they were actually going up and down the motorway with cars stopped at the side of the road. And they were all wondering why all these cars were stopped on the motorway. Because they were stopped to listening. They'd stop and they'd say, "What are you doing?" And they were listening. They couldn't stop. They couldn't get out of the car. They couldn't turn the radio off. They couldn't get away from it and can you imagine if I'd said, "Okay, well, look, this is all very interesting, but I've got to play in the ads."
Right.
It wouldn't work.
Not at all. It kills the whole.
It would be horrible. It would destroy
kills the whole mood, right?
And also, it would just, and the depth of that conversation is so deep at that point that you can't just come out of it like that. So formats can kill, and I think that's why. Not for everybody, of course. Every show is different, every podcast is different, everything is different. But for what we do, I think the lack of a format actually is where the success is, because we don't have a format. And if someone comes on and talks, and some guests, we will say beforehand, "Okay, this is a conversation. We'll probably do 10, 15 minutes with you," and then we're on for an hour and a half because they've told me this amazing story. And look, I am very lucky. I am so lucky to be in a business, to be in a place, to be supported by AMI and our sponsors now as well, who so generously allow us to do this. It is a privilege. It really is a privilege. And I don't use that word lightly. It is a massive privilege to be able to do it, because I've worked in broadcast radio. You can't do that all the time. You couldn't do half of this stuff when I was working in a radio station, because you couldn't. There was still time limits. There were requirements. And there still are to some degree. But I have because of the fact I have 5 days a week, I can afford an hour's conversation on something. When we were doing once a week, no way, we couldn't do it. 5 days a week has given us that flexibility to be able to just talk about whatever we want to talk about. Have a show where we literally have a conversation on a single topic for the whole hour, or it drifts on to something totally different. And then with the extra, I mean, it's purpose.
Tell us about the extra, because I just want to subscribe to the newsletter. And for listeners, go to doubletaponair.com/subscribe and join up. But tell us about extra, because I actually don't know anything about extra. And Michael did tell me to go to that address and subscribe, and I just did it right now.
Months ago.
Yeah,
maybe.
Well, that's
ago,
right, because
dude.
we started the newsletter a few months ago, and that was kind of the driver, not so much the podcast. So what happened was we kind of came to the conclusion there were lots of people who didn't have time to listen to the show. And this is what we're always thinking about. Who can listen? Well, of course, it's great that people listen every day, and there are many, many, many who do. And that's fantastic. But there's also lots of people who would like to listen, but just don't have the time. And also they're maybe the kind of people who want to find something specific, something really specific they would love to hear or go back to. And, I think about, my wife is a orientation and mobility specialist, right? That's her job. And she'll say to me all the time, "Oh, what was that thing you were talking about in the show the other day? Someone in my office was asking about this thing." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's on the show." And she's like, I don't have time for that. And it made me think, well, okay, that's not great from my point of view, because I'm then not delivering the content in a way that can be digestible in a useful way. And so now with the website, which is where it all began, we could post articles, and then those articles could form the basis of a newsletter. And then that newsletter could go out to people who didn't have the time to listen and could essentially see the best of the month as we post the newsletter. And that's how that came about. The podcast idea was because I was getting a bit of itchy feet around some of the subjects we were talking about on the show. You know, despite my jokes when I say it's a tech show, honest, because, you know, oftentimes we do drift off onto other topics. There are some subjects that come up that, you know, in our email or, you know, as part of general discourse. And I think I'd love to talk about this, but Double Tap is not the place. It's just not the place. And there are things I touch on in Double Tap, and I think, I don't even know if this is the right place to do this. There are issues I'd like to talk about, but they're not necessarily tech. And I think people, at the core of why they come, I mean, everyone will have their reason, but I think that the core of it is tech. That's what brings us together. Now, whether that's now evolved out of that, and maybe Double Tap is evolving out of that, I don't know. I don't think it is. I think there's still a need for what we do in the tech space. That needs to still exist in that form. And that was why I had this idea of bringing back, I mentioned earlier, Blind Guy Talks Tech. I had this idea of bringing it back and calling it Blind Guy Gets Real. This was my thing. I was going to bring back this new idea. That was the new podcast idea I had. And I thought, let's do Blind Guy Gets Real. And this is where we can kind of go off in one. And it was going to be separate from Double Tap and nothing to do with it. And just a place we can go, a bit like what you guys have done with Technically Working, almost like a safe haven for you guys to just do what you want to do, say what you want to say. But the challenge we have is that we have a reputation and we have a standard that we've chosen to set for ourselves with Double Tap. And I thought, if we go off and just make this a show where, you know, someone comes on and starts, you know, using the F word or shouting and screaming over here, it just doesn't seem like that would be the kind of thing that our audience would want to engage with. They would find that awkward. They wouldn't find it as enjoyable a listen. And I thought, okay, so we had this chat about, well, why don't we build a podcast that is aligned with Double Tap, but extends the conversations that we have and allows us a place to have those more difficult conversations, but still within the same kind of rule setting that we have. And I think that's important because people know, I think people come to the show having a good idea of what they're going to get. You know, no one's going to automatically jump into some political rant. I mean, politics is a very difficult area right now, as I don't need to tell you guys. And that is one area that comes up a lot in our inbox, and we have to really tread carefully around it. I don't like getting into it because I don't live in the US, so I don't really want to start commenting from afar on people's choice of politics. And, you know, my general view is I can't hate people who vote. You know, people have a right to do whatever they want to do, and if the result is not liked by a section of society, then really that's kind of how it works. That's how it goes. Next time, vote different, or, you know, do a better job of selling your story or whatever you need to do. And I think so. It's very difficult to get into that stuff. And politics and religion are two areas I don't tend to touch.
Same
on Double Tap, and I think that's a safe place to be. Religion's an interesting one because we did actually touch on it a little bit when we were doing Blind Guy Talks Tech. Weirdly enough, it came up a few times because one area it came up in particular was around people who want to pray for us. I don't know if you've had the experience of someone coming up to you and saying,
yes,
you know, I'll put my hands on you and pray for you and pray for your vision to return. And, you know, I have very mixed views about that. As I'm sure many of us do.
I have very strong views about random people just touching me, first of all. Like, don't put your hands on me.
Yeah, that first off, yeah.
It's like, stop it. I have learned, and that's, so I do vaguely remember that conversation now that you mentioned it. And I laughed, I think, the kind of the whole time through, because I could go back through my growth from being a very young man and telling people, you know, don't touch me, like, screw, being very rude about it, to being able to kindly thank them for their desire, and also let them know, don't put your hands on me because I really don't like people touching me. And, you know, kindly remove myself from that situation without having to stand there and go through it, but still being gracious about it, right? Because they, from their perspective, are trying to do something to help me. Like, this is their belief. This is what they think they can do to attempt to help me, when, maybe what you could do to help me is have a conversation. But I have had to learn that. So I laughed that whole time listening to that, now that I think about it, because I remember my journey going through that. But that's kind of a religious thing where here in the U.S., at least, it's a little different, because most people, I think, well, you know what? We're not going to go down that pathway, because then we'll get into the religion conversation.
Well, okay. I mean, look, my take on life at the moment is that, a lot of people say with age comes wisdom. I don't believe that to be true.
No, not necessarily.
I've never believed that.
No.
What I do think comes, though, and again, it's like anything else. It's there for the taking. It is there for you. It's just whether or not you choose to take it. I think wisdom and perspective. What I think is with age comes perspective. Right. Again, you got to look for it, but it's a lighter thing to lift. You can really learn a lot about. I mean, my perspective often comes from conversations I have with different people. I remember once having a chat with a guy who was very annoyed at how sighted people were treating him, and the way people spoke to him, or the way people perhaps engaged with him. Blind and sighted people need to understand more, and they need to understand us better, and they need to do this and they need to do that. And I said, can you tell me 5 things about multiple sclerosis? And he went quiet. And I said, could you tell me 5 things about being deaf? And he said, well, I'm not deaf. I don't know. And I said, but why don't you know? You should know. Don't you feel you should know? I said, because you're demanding the public know everything about you, but you haven't taken any time to learn about 2 specific things I've just mentioned. So what kind of world are we living in here? A world where it revolves around us, or we live within it along with everybody else? What's the world you want to live in?
Right.
And so you have to, I think, sometimes break people out of that thing.
Box.
And,
you have to take them out of that. And sometimes it's just a simple question like that. Like I tell people all the time, they come up to me like, oh, it's so, you get the whole amazing thing, but it's really genuine conversation. Like, I don't understand how you do it. And like, I was at the NFB convention this summer. I had a lot of conversations with some sighted people that were there for, wholly other entire reasons. And we're just shocked that all these blind people are walking around, doing things. And I said, it's one of the things I like to point out to people is everything is perspective, right? Like you said, like from a sighted person's perspective, they have no idea how they would cope with losing their vision. And I tell them from a blind person's perspective, I don't know how I would cope with being in a wheelchair, right? Not that it's the end of the world. I know for sure it's not the end of the world. Like, I don't have the feelings about it that they do, but it's just trying to shift their perspective a little bit. Like, think about it though. We all don't know how we would deal with a situation until we're in it, is the point that I try to get them to understand. Like, I would deal with it if I ended up in a wheelchair, but you ask me right now today, how would I cope? I don't know, because I'm not there. But you learn to cope and adapt when you have to. And I think that makes people think a lot more about their perspective when it comes to dealing with anybody with a disability versus trying to make them understand how it is to be blind. I try to get them to just think about people with differing disabilities, because I have to think about people with differing disabilities. I don't know how to, do certain things or how I would cope as a deaf person. I'm still amazed at the fact, and I will probably forever be amazed, because I don't understand how it worked. For Helen Keller, like, she was blind and deaf. I pointed this out to somebody. I was like, she was blind and deaf. Like, I'm blind, but I can hear. So I was able to learn to speak and communicate. I know deaf people, but they can see, so they were able to learn sign language so they could learn to communicate. She was both deaf and blind. I have no idea how that works. I don't know how I would deal with that. I would have to learn, but I have no idea where you even start at that point, right?
And the reality is, if you have that conversation with someone who's deaf-blind and they tell you, well, actually, I do this and I do that, and this is how I communicate, and this is how I do what I do, then that gives you the perspective to say, oh, okay.
Okay, now I get it.
Yeah. But again, that has to be taken. That's the other thing I will say, because it's all available to you. Wisdom, perspective, it's all there to be taken. You just have to want to. So the amount of people I've spoken to who, for example, are sighted, and who I will tell them what I do, and I will tell them how I do it, will still say, God, it's amazing. But then, 5 minutes later, they'll just assume that I'm, unemployed, or they just go back to the default setting. It's like, you're not hearing what I'm saying here. It's like you're not adding this up to realize that because. So I remember once being on a train and someone, I thought this was really telling actually, for a number of reasons. I thought it was very interesting. I was on a train. I was talking to someone on the phone, and I'd come off the phone. I was using my Bluetooth keyboard. My phone's to my side, and I've got my headphones connected to it. And I'm using, and obviously the screen curtain is on, so there's no screen on. And I'm using the phone as the computer. I'm doing my emails and whatever else. And someone across the table from me, it was like four seats around a table.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy leans over to me and he says, "Can I just ask a question? Can I ask, what is it you're doing there? How are you?" Because you've got a keyboard, but it's not connected to anything. And you've got a phone that looks dead. And you've got an earpiece in. So what's going on?
Do you know your phone's not on?
Yeah, and
I get that all the time.
And you can see, and look, and I know people who will jump on that and say, "How dare you? Don't you realize I'm blind and I can do anything?" I don't choose that path. No. I try not to choose that path. And I think, go into it with what is, look at the question. It's inquiring. It's an inquiring mind. And I'm intrigued to help people where I can, and if I have the time, and it was a perfect situation. I could sit and talk to the person, and I really enjoy it sometimes. I enjoy telling people the story. Don't get me wrong, it's a journey, right? Through the course of this whole sight loss thing or blindness thing, there are different stages to it. Some days I would rather just, leave the table and walk away, or, and get off at the next stop, quite frankly. But in this day, he caught me on a good day. And so I started having this conversation. I was explaining to him how it worked. And it was interesting because over a period of the 5 or 6 minutes we were talking, other people were kind of coming around and kind of like gathering around the blind guy to figure out what on earth was going on. And they were all fascinated by it. But the real fascinating bit was right at the end of the conversation, when everyone had kind of had their bit and, understood it and all left. He turned around to me and he said, "You're Stephen Scott, aren't you?" Now, I am not enough of an egotist to think, "Oh, he's a listener to Double Tap." I thought he knows me from somewhere, right? It's not about the show.
Right.
I'm not that guy. I'm not one of those. "Oh, of course I'm Stephen Scott. How long have you listened?" I'm not one of those people. Trust me, I'm not. So I genuinely thought he knows me from somewhere. Maybe I've worked with this guy. Maybe I've met him before. He said, "Oh, you're my cousin." And I'm like, "What?" And I hadn't seen this guy in 15 years. And I kind of thought it was interesting that he spotted that bit last. He saw blind guy, technology, but didn't see the face. Do you know what I mean? It was like he was literally encapsulated by the tech and what I was doing. And it was at the very last moment he saw me. And I thought that was a really interesting moment because it kind of highlights to me how people see us.
Right.
They see the disability or the blindness or the whatever first. And it's so difficult because you get people who get really animated about it. I see, LinkedIn, the world's biggest bragging network. People love to go on there and talk about all these experiences they've had and how, if only this person had done this and if only this person had said that and only if this... I try not to allow myself to get worked up on every single time someone says something or does something. There was a time, but I've kind of gotten over it. I remember someone saying to me once, an old boss said to me, "I don't even see you as a blind person." Now, as you know, if you listen to the show and you know me, you know that language is not a thing I obsess over. Call me anything you want. Call me anything. Call me late for dinner. I don't care. And so I didn't take those words as anything more than what they were, because what I was looking at was the intention behind them. And the intention was, you seem so capable at what you do, I can't imagine you're blind. Now, I know how it sounds when you say it out loud, and I've debated this with myself so many times. In fact, I've even gone the other way on this. I've gone to the other extent of the argument and said, if I was having that conversation again, I would love to say, okay, I'm now going to, because my boss was a woman, I'd love to say to her, okay, I'm going to say this to you now, but I'm going to say exactly the same thing back to you, but I'm going to say, I don't see you as a woman. How does that fit with you? Does that work for you? Because I don't think it will. So I've gone to that end of the argument, and I've had that debate with myself around this. Is that an appropriate reaction to kind of almost see it as you're almost not seeing me because the blindness is present in me. But I think the thing that comes out of all this is really where you see your disability as part of you. Do you see it as the thing that's in front of you, or do you see it as part of you?
Right. Is it the thing that defines you, or is it just a characteristic of you? Right.
Am I a blind guy, or am I a guy who's blind? And I think that's a really. I think there are becoming two camps on this, and it's not about sowing division, because God knows there's enough of that. But I do think there are two camps here. I think there's a camp that says I'm a blind guy, and it's funny because every time I have this discussion, every time I say I'm all about person first, and I'm Stephen first, and everything else follows. Some smart ass gets in touch and says, "Well, on X, your username is Blind Guy Tech. What does that say?" And I'm like, yeah, because that's a persona. That's also a descriptor of who I am. Because, it's very hard.
It helped people find you when you did a show that was called Blind Guy Talks Tech, right?
Yes. And I got trouble for that as well. People were like, why are you saying Blind Guy Talks Tech if you're all about people first? And I'm like, because I need to explain to the audience who I am. Nobody knows who I am just by... If I called it the Stephen Scott Show? Would that mean anything to anybody? Yeah, if you know who I am, yeah. But if you don't, who's this Stephen Scott guy, and why should I care what he's got to say about anything? Oh, there's a blind guy talking about tech. That's interesting. That hooks you in. So that was the reason I did that. But it always fascinates me how people love to jump on those things. It's like, yeah, I am people first. I'm person first. And because that's what matters to me, people. Nothing else matters at the end of the day, truthfully. If you think about the worst days you've had in your life, you're not going to think about a disability or a condition. You're going to think about a person. You're going to think about a situation. Your crash, my crash when I was in mine. It was absolutely not helped by the fact being blind in that situation meant that this was just a horrible and even probably more horrible situation in some ways, but equally as horrible to anyone else who's in a crash. But the blindness put a barrier in front of us in the way that we weren't able to see the car coming at us, so we couldn't do anything to mitigate it, right? We thankfully, my guy shouted brace, but, in your case, you didn't have that. But the blindness had no part to play, really. It had nothing to do with it. You were in a car crash. It was a horrible experience.
Yeah.
And that's at the core of it for me. It's like, we've got to strip these things away. I think we're getting to the point where we're adding labels to almost... I had a phrase once and I thought it was brilliant, was oppression Olympics, which I love this. People, it's the I'm more disabled, I've got more conditions than you have, or I have this, or, but my condition's worse. And I see this happening more and more, this kind of almost victimization of ourselves. And I think we've got to stop this, because it's not good for us. We cannot live in a world, I don't think we can live in a world where we blame everyone else for every other problem that exists. We've got to take some responsibility of our own lives. And, we have got limited ability to change things about our own lives. And where we do have that ability, we should do it. We should take charge. Anyway, the long story short, we've got an extra podcast, and it's going to talk about a lot of different things. I think that was the question you asked me about 3 months ago.
But, it's interesting that last bit of what you just said, though, because I have said this to a lot of people, just speaking about the general public. I feel like a lot of the issues that we face in the world, a lot of the division that is happening in the world is due to the fact that people don't take personal responsibility for themselves. And there are so many areas that I've been able to kind of identify that, from the microcosm of us, blind people or people with disabilities who want to blame everybody else. Well, they didn't consider this, or they didn't give me that, or they didn't make this successful. Yeah. They didn't do X, Y, Z. To, a racial situation, and excuse me because it's not how I think, but, a black guy saying, the white man's keeping me down, or they gave all the jobs to the white people, and they promoted the white guy first, that type of talk, and they're similar on the other side. So there's all of that type of stuff, right? But again, you have to take responsibility for your actions in your life. Like, we don't have the ability to individually change the entire world. But as you said, we have a limited ability to change things about our lives, to try to do differently. And if everybody were to take responsibility, I do believe the world would be in a better place versus trying to foist the responsibility off onto everybody else. But I also feel like, to a certain extent, that society has moved in that direction simply because, I look at our not to talk politics, but I look at our political setup here in the U.S., for example. This is that case in a lot of places, but, over the years, from the beginning of this country up till now, it has gone from the people, the citizens, being active in the process of making decisions about what the government did to, we'll just hand the responsibility over to this guy, right? And everybody votes for who they vote for. The person who wins. That's how it's always been. But we are less involved today as citizens in what happens locally, all the way up to a national level, than we were, say, 100 years ago. 100 years ago, people were much more involved. Even though they had representatives for them, they were much more involved in what went on. Now everybody wants to sit around and watch the TikTok and then complain about things that don't happen, right? But again, you're not taking responsibility for what you didn't do. And I think that's a problem that we as a world face, not just on a level of us being having a disability, or us being people with vision problems or any other disability. I think it's a world issue to a certain extent that we're facing when it comes to that personal responsibility.
You've got to remove identity out of this. This is the biggest problem. Identity politics, I think, is a huge issue in our world because it divides us. Yep. It says, you are getting something I'm not, and I want that. Or I want more because I am this. And because, I'm about equality. Down the line equality. That's it. Good old-fashioned, what used to be liberal equality. Not by outcome, not by quotas, not by, we don't have enough bricklayers who are female, so, we need to make sure we employ 50% more bricklayers who are female. But that would mean that there's now a whole bunch of women who didn't really want to be bricklayers now being told, well, you've got to be a bricklayer because
right.
we need to fill these quotas. And that's the problem with equality of outcome, right? You end up with this situation where you've got people who are almost being forced into a role they never wanted to do in the first place. If you had, an equality that says, look, you can do whatever you want to do, regardless of who you are, where your background, whatever else. And obviously there are always challenges. I'm not saying that you get to nirvana, but if the goal is everyone has the same shot, that's a great way to play. That's a much better overall goal, I think.
Exactly.
It's a much better aim. I'm not saying we'll get there in every single case, but it's a better goal rather than this idea, and I see it all the time, especially in the disability community. I see a lot of people who, it feels to me they don't want equality, they want more. They want, they often say, we don't want special treatment, but I would like someone to take me around the store, please, and I would like this, and I would like you to carry my bag, and I would like you to put me in a taxi, and I don't want to get a train because I'd much rather be in... And it's like, whoa, hang on a minute, that's not equality. Equality is get the bus with everybody else, get around the store yourself, use your apps, learn to use technology, learn to use the stuff that the technology that's there, whatever else. The one that gets me all the time, and I get it to an extent, but it's the people it comes from. There are advocates online who are very smart, intelligent people who are using technology every day. And these same people complain that a letter, a piece of paper in standard print of all things, comes through their door. And they're up in arms about it. This is a disgrace. An absolute disgrace. This letter's not accessible to me. Standing holding an iPhone, which has got apps on it that could read that letter just by pointing at it. Or, they're wearing smart glasses that you could just say, what does this letter say? The fact is they have the answer. Now, look, I also understand that part of the reason they're making this argument is because there are people who don't have access to that technology or don't have knowledge to use that technology. I would argue that number of people is getting lower. And I would argue that number is definitely not as much as it used to be, certainly in the last 20 years. Because there's more people, you think about just age and demographics and how things have changed. You know, it's not the case now that an 80-year-old woman, this is always the thing that they used to put to me at RNIB, but what about the 80-year-old woman who hasn't got access to anything? And I'm like, who is this person? Who is this person? I'm not saying they don't exist, but who are they? Because I've met some really smart and savvy 80-year-old blind people who are way more techie than I am to some degree, because they know they had to be. You know, it was like, well, I have to learn how to use this to survive, to get on. You know, sometimes it was because the wrong technology was put in that person's hands, so they never got to grips with it. Someone gave them an Android phone that was just, you know, sitting in a drawer. They had no idea how a screen reader worked because no one taught them how to use it. That's the stuff we need to sort.
Right. Those are the problems that we have to solve. I definitely agree.
We've got to equip ourselves. You know, I believe we have to equip ourselves the best way we can. You know, it gives us agency. I'm no victim to anybody. And I'm not a victim of society. This whole thing I see now about the social model of disability, I don't know if this is getting to the US, but there's a big push now on this idea that we should move away from the medical model of disability, which is that there's an eye condition and you've got a disability and therefore, you know, you have this issue and this is going to cause you challenges. Instead, we move towards this social model of disability that says, no, the disability is not the issue, it's everyone else.
How does that work? Like that's not, again, that's not taking responsibility first off, right? Like you said,
it puts the responsibility on everyone else. It makes us victims.
I can't make society responsible for me as a blind person, or you know, it's not me that has to adapt, but society has to adapt to me. Is basically what I'm hearing. This argument is not that I have to adapt to the world, but the world has to adapt to me, which is just infinitely ridiculous to me from just a general standpoint. Because then everybody could come out from some perspective and say that, right? Like whether it's a person with a recognized disability, whether it's blindness, deafness, multiple sclerosis, autism. Oh, the world has to adapt to me instead of me adapting to the world. There should be some accommodations and allowances for sure, because that's what we as a society have to do. Like I have to accommodate the fact that this older lady may need an arm to climb up these 3 steps or 4 steps to get into the courthouse. It doesn't mean she's a victim. It's just she needed a little help, right? That doesn't mean that, we have to do away with all steps because anybody that is elderly can't go up the steps, or we have to do away with all. You know, it gets just to it verges on the ridiculous to me just to hear that argument. Like, and I don't know, Mike, has this reached over here to where people are like, the disability is not the. Wait, Stephen, explain to him what this is again, because I'm all kind of.
Yeah, so the whole thing was in the UK for a long time. They called it the medical model of disability, right? Now, these are terms used by academics, you know, people who have brains and not much common sense.
Oh, so these people who spent all their time in a classroom and in a book and
exactly.
not outside of
life.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And, you know, they talk about the medical model, which is essentially where we've lived for a long time, where you're given a diagnosis and you're told, okay, this is the case, you're blind or you're low vision or whatever it might be. And now, you know, good luck with your life and you're going to face a number of challenges and this is the way the world is going to be. Social model of disability is, well, you know, actually the issue of disability is not on the person, it's on society. Society is the barrier. People are the barrier to our success. So websites are inaccessible. 2 examples that were given, actually, which I thought were really interesting because I think it kind of brings my view out, which is, one was, you know, you go into a restaurant and you can't read the menu and there isn't an accessible alternative. And the other example was someone who uses a wheelchair goes to a restaurant for a meal and can't get in because there's no
stairs.
ramp.
Yeah, okay.
Now, what that tells me is that actually we're in a world of everything. Social models, medical models, whatever the model you want to call it is. We're in the middle of all this. It's like most things in life, right? It's a bit of everything. You can't entirely blame society for every problem. However, for the person in the wheelchair trying to get into the restaurant, it is on the restaurant to build the ramp.
Society didn't accommodate them in that particular instance. Like
so
I said, there's give and take, right? There's a little bit of give and take.
But in the restaurant, I would argue there's an alternative way for that individual to get that menu. But have they prepared for it? So have you downloaded an app? Have you got a Seeing AI? Have you got some kind of OCR to read your menu? Whatever it might be, you're using AI to do it. Whatever it might be.
Are you willing to ask the waiter or waitress to read the menu to you?
Exactly.
Right.
So there are ways, and I think that's the thing. It's
that's
like
something
when
where
you
can adapt. Right, that's
exactly.
a situation where you're able to adapt to make this work. Whereas, an example with the person in the wheelchair, like that's a case where society needs to make an adaptation or an accommodation, I would say, in that point, right? But again, it all makes sense.
Yeah, I think both things are true. I think I'm always.
That's the problem, right? Is so many people don't see that there are two sides of two different things can be true that seem to be opposing points, right? Like I can say that I am perfectly capable of being independent and navigating the world, but occasionally I'm going to ask somebody to do sighted guide. Why? Not because I couldn't do it, but because honestly it's more efficient in that point in time to have somebody help me through this situation right here.
You know what worries me most of all these days is that it's not that there aren't opposing views, it's that people don't want to hear them. That's the worry for me now. We're in a world where people don't want to hear it. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. There are some people, and I think in the disability community, there are certain people, and I'm starting to see some criticism of it, and I think it's about time. Because I've wondered it for a while, but it is interesting that I do see a bit of an industry growing around disability advocacy at the moment. Now, that's not inherently a problem, but it is depending on who's delivering the message. And how is that individual, and often is an individual, how are they qualified to speak to a room of hundreds of people on, the issues of an entire community? When, as we said earlier, it's like I barely know my own condition, never mind trying to explain someone else's or multiples of those conditions or whatever it might be. So it's very hard to stand up and say, I know everything on this topic. I'm a disability expert. I've seen this on LinkedIn profiles, and I think, what the hell does that mean? You're an expert in what? Because I often say this in the show, and I say it pointedly. When you've heard the view of one blind person or one disabled person, what you've just heard is the view of one blind or disabled person. That's it. And I think we have to be careful. We've spent a lot of time trying to tell people we're not a monolith. We're not one group of people who think one way. And suddenly we're creating these industries where, people are basically going around saying we all feel and think the same way. And the idea of othering is bad, saying it's all everyone else's fault. I don't like that. And it's the absolute nature of it. I heard someone say this, it was not my line, but I heard someone use the line, the new N word is nuance. And I love that line because it's true. No one likes to hear about the other side of the argument or, well, actually, let's consider this from a broader perspective. It's no, this is my view, this is how I feel, and I've got 50 people online who agree with me. So therefore, I'm right.
Yeah, but
this is the new culture.
And that's the terrible thing about it, right? Everybody wants everything to be one side or the other, and it like you said, it creates divisiveness. Like, again, as a group of people who are blind, there are 3 of us on this call right now who are all blind. And I'm betting we all have differing opinions about different things when it comes to certain things, right? For example, apps, right? There are some apps that are good. There are sometimes I don't want to be bothered with an app to try to deal with a thing because it is frustrating and it's slow and it's tedious and I am in a hurry, right? But that does not mean that for Stephen, so let's use that menu example, right? We're gonna give people a way to understand how 2 different things can be true, and we can still get along while we're on this call once this is done. So we go to a restaurant. Stephen pulls out his phone to read the menu because there's not a Braille menu available. So he pulls out his phone or let's say Stephen, and I'm not picking on you, Stephen, but Stephen is not the best Braille reader in the world. So he doesn't even ask for a Braille menu. He pulls out his phone. He's like, okay, I'm going to use, whatever app, Ira, Seeing AI, whatever, to read the menu and find what I'm looking for. I come in and I'm like, do you have a Braille menu? There's no Braille menu. To shortcut a whole bunch of time for me, I'm probably going to ask the waiter or waitress. So I'm interested in steak. So what steak options do you have on the menu? We both ultimately end up with a meal. We have a great conversation. And we, Steven takes the bus home and I take a Uber Comfort because I'm lazy.
Yeah.
None of that is wrong. Neither one of us is a bad blind person. Neither one of us is representing the entire culture of blind people from any side. This is what I choose to do as an individual, just like you do what you choose to do as an individual. And there's no way for one person to stand up and speak for a group of, I can't speak for everybody in my household. Hell, to be honest, there's some days I can't speak for myself. So
yeah.
There's no way somebody else can talk for me when there are times I can't talk for me. And that is a concerning thing. But like you said, I think the bigger concern is the social divisiveness, whether it's in our community, the wider disabled community, or the wider world, is nobody wants to hear the other side, or nobody wants to hear the fact that, hey, there's not a, as the old term is, there's not a black and white. It's not yes or no. It's not just simple yes and no answers. It is a maybe or possibly, or in this situation, yes, that situation, no, and nobody wants to deal with that.
It's like people who say, oh, the world's run by 5 people, on a mountain somewhere. And, you get someone else saying, oh, no, there's no government secretly. It's like, what the reality? It's a bit of everything.
Probably a little bit of all of that,
That's
right?
That's the truth. It's a bit of everything. It's not the extreme conspiracy theory. It's not the building collapsed, what's weird. It's not, there's all a bit of something of truth. I don't know why on my feed I get so many 9/11 conspiracies that come up on my feed. I do not seek them out. It just seems to be a thing that I think the algorithm is trying to work out who you are. And so it throws these things into the mix. And if you dare stay on it for more than like 10 seconds, you're suddenly listening to this. And then suddenly that's all you're getting is videos about this topic. And it fascinates me.
Now, see, that's where I'm going to get up in arms about a thing, right? Because are we talking X or Facebook here?
Oh, Facebook usually.
Facebook? Okay. So this is where I'm going to get up in arms, because I have experienced this, not recently, so I could be absolutely wrong by the time I'm done saying all of this. But I'm going to get up in arms about a thing. You're scrolling through your Facebook timeline, and they show you a thing about a 9/11 conspiracy. Whereas a blind person is going to take you a second to read what they're talking about before you can move off of it. But now it's tagged you. You are now a 9/11 conspiracist. So that's the next thing you're going to get, right? See, Facebook, Meta, needs to accommodate for that fact. Hey, I got a screen reader going on. Don't tag me so fast. I'm not a conspiracist. I just had to read what it was before I decided, no, I don't want that.
Well, the other side of it for me, again, I'm a curious person. I like hearing what people have got to say, and I will. And the thing that gets me is people often say, "Well, why do you listen to it?" And I'm like, because I'm interested in what other people have got to say. I don't want to sit. I remember once there was an ad for a service run by RNIB. It was on the radio station I worked on, and every time it came on, I always used to laugh. It was a great service, and it was a brilliant thing. It wasn't about the service, but it was just the way that it was phrased. And it said, "Do you want to meet like-minded people?" And I'm like, no, I absolutely do not want to meet like-minded people. I cannot think of anything worse. People like me, oh my God, I spent a room with Stephen Scott's. Can you imagine? That's the last thing I want. I want to meet people who think that the world's flat, or think that the Twin Towers were brought down by controlled explosion. Because it's not that I can in any way change their mind. And I don't want to change their mind. I just want their perspective on things. Where are they coming from? Because I find that, you can't just write people off because you don't agree with them. That's the mistake we make. We do it in politics. And, people are writing off. And again, I'm not a Trump guy. I'm not interested in that. I'm not from the US. I will admit, we had Mr. Trump over here in Scotland. We looked after him for a few days. I think we shouted at him quite a bit as well. I didn't, but other people did. But, you can't write off half a population of a country because they didn't vote the way you did, and therefore they're all this or they're all that. We've gone through this in the UK with Brexit. It's the same thing here. You can't write everybody off, because if you do that, you sow the division. You're saying, that bunch of people, I don't want anything to do with them. And what you realize is, very quickly, and I learned this growing up, I learned this firsthand with an experience that I had with my mother, because my mother and my father, and my mother and my grandmother in particular, because my father wasn't there, she was saying horrible things about people from India. Let's just put it that way. in Scotland, we had a huge influx. I say a huge influx, but a large influx of population from India in the 60s, the 1960s. And a lot of Indian people came to Scotland and, worked bloody hard to achieve what they did. And, probably some of the hardest working people in the country. And they were treated with such disdain, such horrible things were said. And my family were pretty bad at coming out with things that, it was almost part of the culture to say those things. Things that were words you would never say today were just said in front of people.
Right.
And it was almost the people who were facing this vitriol had to laugh along with it almost just to get by. But it must have been dying inside every single time they heard it. It was horrible. And I remember one day in particular, I always remember this. I said to my mum, why are you so nasty towards Indian people? Why do you say these horrible things? And she explained her reasons, which were not very nice to hear. And I don't believe she even believed what she was saying, to be perfectly honest, but okay. And I said, it's interesting because when you see Abdul, who runs the local shop down the road, you're always really nice to him. And she said, but he's different. And I said, well, what's different about him? And she said, oh, I like him. And that was the moment of perspective for me there. That was a real mark in a line for me to say, so really what you're saying is, if you got to know people who are Indian, you might actually like them. Because you just met someone and you liked him. And you were friends and you talked and never called him those words. And that is it for me. It is all about that for me. It's about just go meet people. I remember a friend, she just had a child. And she said to me, I don't know why she asked me, because I don't have kids. I don't particularly like them. And, generally smell and kick the back of my seat whenever I'm on a train or plane. So, I find it quite irritating. And, she's asking me, what advice would you give a parent? She said, because I think the fact you don't have a child would make your answer quite interesting. And I said, take them traveling. Don't let them stagnate in the country that they're in. Take them traveling. Show them the world. Go see other cultures. Go spend time. Take them out of their comfort zone. I guarantee you, their lives will be enriched by it in ways that an education sitting in a classroom will not give you. You can do that. If you can take your kid around the world, and you don't have to go to the fanciest places, go to other countries. I spent time in Africa. I've spent time in a lot of different countries around the world, but I spent time in Africa, and that was one place, in Ghana in particular, and it changed my worldview overnight about things. It changed my overnight view. And, I don't get into the details of that. There was a lot of views I had, probably abhorrent, I don't know, but certainly negative about Africa, about what it must be like to live there. That was really the kind of basis of my thought. I suppose if I admit it, it was that I just thought, why would anyone want to be here if they could get out of it? Would you want to be out of it? And then I went there,
and it wasn't what you expected.
And I'm like, these folk are great. I mean, I couldn't understand why everyone was so happy. They had so little, but they were so happy. And so I realized another thing in my life, which was maybe things don't make you happy. Maybe money isn't the driver. Maybe having all this nice stuff is nice, but is it really making us happy? And I've spent time with people who are millionaires and people who've got nothing. And the people I'd rather hang about with are the people with nothing, because they generally seem to have a better life. They may not have as much things. They will definitely have a harder life. But by God, do they know what family mean? They know what people, friendships mean. They know what the heart of life is about. It's other people, right? It's not about stuff. Yeah, okay, I love my toys and I love my keyboards, but, if I get a call from the hospital saying my wife's ill, where am I going? Right. I'm in a taxi heading there now. Nothing else matters. That's the reality of what's important. And I think we really have to get to a point in our world, and we're going to have to reach it soon, where we stop labeling ourselves or dividing ourselves up into boxes. Just, for God's sake, let's start seeing each other as people. Just let's start realizing there's more in common. We have way more in common than anything
we have in difference. Right, exactly. And it's interesting your journey, going to Africa, and before you went, it's like, why would people want to live there? Or I'm pretty sure that everybody that lives there probably would like to move somewhere else, and then you go there and find out everybody's happy. That is a very similar, and you being the person that you are, were able to adjust you had a preconceived notion, and you were able to adjust that. And I think that's the thing that we need more people to do, because it's the same conversation that we as blind people have with sighted people before they met a blind person, or when they meet a blind person and realize that there are blind people out here in the world. They're like, oh my God, it must be the most terrible thing in the world. Spend enough time, or go to a convention and see a ton of blind people walking around, New Orleans, and doing a whole bunch of stuff, TikToking and all this crap. And like, oh, I guess it ain't that bad, right? But they wouldn't think about that until they see it. And it's interesting, the similarities there that we have, and that I think crosses a lot of social situations, is just whether or not we as people in general can come to a point to where we're willing to learn something different and see things differently. And, you may go into a situation with preconceived notions, or you may have expectations, but can you allow those expectations to be shifted or changed and accept that? And I think a lot of people are not, but we need that to happen. And like you, I feel like we need it to happen sooner rather than later. We want to thank everybody for listening. This has been episode 134 of Technically Working with our guest, Stephen Scott. You can check out Stephen's work over at www.doubletaponair.com. And you can also send us feedback at technicallyworking.show. You can catch Michael on Mastodon. He is Payon, Payown, at dragonscave.space. You can find me on Mastodon, Damashe, Damashe, at technically.social, and follow our bot, TW, at technically.social. And of course, you can use the hashtag technically working on that platform, and we appreciate if you capitalize the T and the W. Big shout out to all of our listeners. As always, thank you so much. And the hugest thanks and biggest hugs to our tip jar subscribers. You can find out more about that by going to technicallyworking.show, and from that page, clicking on support us. Until next time, thank you for listening.